All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's dive right into this exam revision explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through today's material because, well, we get to play historical detectives. Today, we are conducting a full-blown autopsy of Sparta's 5th century leadership crisis. If you're gearing up to write an essay on this period, you already know that understanding Sparta's shifting role in Greece is absolutely fundamental. We're going to unpack exactly why the legendary victors of the Persian Wars suddenly found themselves paralyzed by scandal, internal rot, and just a desperate shortage of manpower. So grab your notebooks, get comfortable, and let's dissect this historical mystery together. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the leadership crisis. Then, the disgrace of the royal houses. After that, we'll hit the internal crises, spend some time evaluating our sources, and finally, look at Sparta's recovery. Starting right off with Section 1, the leadership crisis. Why exactly did Sparta retreat from the Aegean? Okay, picture the scene. It's roughly 478 BC. Sparta is sitting pretty as the undisputed leader of the Greek world after crushing Persia. And then they just suddenly walk away. Why? Well, think about this famous quote from Thucydides. He notes that the Spartans stopped sending commanders explicitly out of fear that they'd become corrupted. He's telling us that Sparta's retreat wasn't just some generous gesture to let Athens take the wheel or a passive oversight. It was a highly calculated, frankly fearful reaction to the scandalous behavior of their own regent, Pausanias. When Pausanias was out commanding the Greek fleet, he literally started wearing Persian dress. He got himself a Persian bodyguard and started treating his allies with immense arrogance. It's like the very values that made Spartans respected at home, the austerity, the obedience, the discipline, completely shattered the second they were exposed to foreign wealth and power. Moving on to Section 2. Disgrace of the royal houses, a dynasty in tatters. That fear of corruption we just talked about, it wasn't an isolated incident. Not at all. It was a glaring symptom of a much larger disease infecting the absolute top of Spartan society. Let's trace the timeline of this collapse, because it really is a dynasty in tatters. In 478 BC, Pausanias is recalled and disgraced. Just 2 years later, 476 BC, King Leotitus, the actual hero who led the Greeks to final victory at Mycale, is convicted of accepting bribes in Thessaly and gets exiled. At this point, getting exiled for bribery was practically a royal Spartan pastime. Because these leaders kept falling from grace, the kingship kept passing to underage boys. That meant Sparta had to constantly rely on regents, like Cleombrotus, who led the Dorias expedition in 458 BC. And incredibly, the cycle just kept repeating. Fast forward to 446 BC, King Pleistyonyx invades Attica, achieves absolutely nothing, gets accused of bribery, and boom, straight into exile. The great heroes of the Persian War had turned into a rolling diplomatic disaster. Now, if you want to write a truly top-tier essay, you've got to look past the obvious. On the surface, sure, you have these highly visible external failures, kings acting arrogantly, parading around in Persian clothes, and taking bribes, but you have to contrast that with the hidden, internal constraints. Because while the kings were out humiliating themselves abroad, the actual foundations of Spartan society were quietly crumbling back home in the Peloponnese. Which brings us to Section 3, internal crises, specifically oliganthropia and the Helot revolts. Let's dig into the structural rot underneath the armor. If you take away literally one technical term from this explainer today, make it this one, oliganthropia. It translates to a shortage of men. Throughout the entire 5th century, the number of full Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, was in a complete freefall. And this is a massive, compounding factor to the leadership crisis. Even if Sparta hadn't been busy exiling half its royal family, the actual pool of qualified, elite men available to send on overseas commands was rapidly shrinking. It forced them to rely way more heavily on the perioikoi, the free non-citizens, and even the enslaved helots just to fill out their military ranks. So here is the million-dollar essay question. I want you to really chew on this as you study. Was the withdrawal from the Aegean alliance primarily a moral failure of kingship, driven by the corrupting influence of foreign wealth? Or was it a demographic failure, dictated by the brutal math of oliganthropia? To really answer this, we have to look at what happened when Sparta finally did try to act. In 465 BC, Sparta secretly promised to help the island of Thasos revolt against Athens. They were finally ready to step back onto the world stage. But immediately, absolute disaster struck. A massive earthquake devastated Sparta. The historian Diodorus highlights the horrific human cost of this event, and the devastation instantly triggered a massive uprising of the Helots, Sparta's enslaved underclass. According to Thucydides, this revolt lasted a grueling 10 years, all the way until 455 BC. So think about the timing. Right when Sparta wanted to project power externally, they were structurally crippled at home. For Sparta, internal security always had to trump external ambition. Moving to Section 4, Evaluating Sources. It's time to cross-examine our witnesses. Okay, professor hat on for a second. As historians, we can't just take these dramatic stories of earthquakes and corrupt kings at face value. We have to evaluate who is telling the story. Let's break down our three main guys. First, Thucydides. He's our most detailed narrative source, but remember, he's writing during the Peloponnesian War, looking back decades later. He's not an eyewitness to the Pentaconasia, that 50-year gap between the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. Then we have Herodotus. Writing for a general Greek audience, he points out that Athens used Pausanias' bad behavior as a highly convenient excuse to just take over. And finally, Diodorus. Yes, he's a much later 1st century BC source, but he provides vital details about the internal debates inside Sparta itself, essentially filling in the gaps that Thucydides leaves behind. And you must always keep this warning in mind. Thucydides has an analytical agenda. He's actively constructing a narrative to explain his truest cause of the Peloponnesian War, which is the massive growth of Athenian power. Because of this pro-Athenian framing, he might actually be making the transfer of power look a little too smooth. Ask yourself, is he overplaying Spartan failure and underplaying the fact that Athens was aggressively seeking an opportunity to build an empire? Finally, Section 5, Recovery through Non-Royals, or, as I like to call it, breaking the rules to win. Because listen, history isn't just a straight downward line of decline. Despite the disgrace of their kings, the shrinking population, and those devastating Helot revolts, Sparta did recover, and they ultimately won the Peloponnesian War. So how did they pull it off? They bought themselves breathing room through extremely careful diplomacy and defense. Step 1. Between 479 and 465 BC, they successfully defended the Peloponnese against localized threats from places like Tegea and Argos, keeping their core alliance intact. Step 2. In 451 BC, they utilized the return of the pro-Spartan Athenian Cimon to secure a 5-year truce with Athens. And Step 3, they immediately used that truce to negotiate a 30-year peace with Argos, brilliantly locking down their traditional enemy right in their own backyard. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate delicious irony of Spartan history. Think about it. The traditional Spartan system, led by royal kings like Pausanias and Pleisdonax, proved incredibly vulnerable to corruption and failure. But the eventual Spartan victory in 404 BC, that was secured almost entirely by a new class of non-royal commanders. Men like Brasidas up in Thrace, Gylippus over in Sicily, and above all, the brilliant Navarch Lysander. These men broke the traditional molds and succeeded exactly where the ancient royal houses had so spectacularly failed. To really hammer this point home, consider this incredible tradition preserved by Plutarch. Even though Plutarch is writing much later, and yes, he represents an idealizing view of Sparta, he explicitly names commanders like Brasidas and Lysander, noting that Greeks willingly accepted them. They actually called them teachers of civilized life. This is your positive counter-narrative right here. It shows that Spartan leadership itself wasn't entirely rotten. Rather, it was the rigid traditional kingship model that just struggled to adapt to the complex new world of the 5th century Aegean. Which leaves us here with the ultimate summary question to take into your exams. Was Sparta's 5th century struggle primarily a failure of kingship, a moral corruption of its elite? Or was it a failure of demographics, the inescapable vice of oliganthropia and Helot revolts? The absolute best essays will argue that you can't separate the two. They feed off each other. A shrinking citizen pool meant every corrupt or exiled leader hurt tenfold. Think deeply about how these two forces interact, evaluate your sources carefully, and I promise you, you will write an outstanding essay. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer, and best of luck with your revision.